Hello, everyone. It's 5 minutes past the hour, so let's start. We are pleased to welcome you to the data collection webinar series, which is organized by the Data Collection Unit at UNICEF headquarters. I'm Attila Hanjoğlu. I'm the chief of the Data Collection Unit in UNICEF headquarters. This series is covering topics that have recently gained relevance, importance, and where there's ongoing work on how best to collect data. Today's topic is latest developments on collecting data on children's time use. Before I introduce the presenters today, some housekeeping rules. We have scheduled about an hour and 30 minutes, including Q&A. Throughout the webinar, please remain muted. Kindly write your questions in the chat box, and we will try to group your questions and direct them to the presenters during the quick Q&A segment. We are recording this webinar, and this will be available on our internal SharePoint site, together with the past webinars. But we will also be posting this to the Mix YouTube channel, so it will be publicly available. And you can find the links to both of these in the email that you received earlier. As I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is entitled Latest Developments on Collecting Data on Children's Time Use, and I'm very pleased to welcome 4 presenters. We have 2 colleagues from the UN Statistics Division, Francesca Grum, who is the Assistant Director and Chief of the Demographic and Social Statistics Branch of the UN Statistics Division. And we have Iliana Vaca-Trigo, who is a statistician in the Social and Gender Statistics section at the United Nations Statistics Division also. We also have 2 UNICEF colleagues, Lauren Pandolfelli, who is a statistics and monitoring specialist in the data and analytics section in UNICEF headquarters, and Eva Quintana, who is in the data collection unit of the data and analytics section of DAPM UNICEF. Here's how we're going to go about this. Francesca and Iliana will provide an overview of the current guidelines being used, and then Lauren and Eva will follow up presenting UNICEF's work on collecting data on children's time use. Without further ado, I would like to now pass it on to Francesca to start the presentation. Francesca, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Attila, and greetings from New York. Very pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to talk to colleagues who are in the field missions. Yes, I think we are all set. I hope you can hear me. Thumbs up. Yes.
Very well. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So as Attila just mentioned, Iliana and I will give you an initial overview of the importance of collecting time use data and producing time use statistics, knowing that Lauren and Eva will then zoom in into the need for this data from the angle of children's well-being. Next slide. So we will talk about 3 major things. I will start by setting the stage and sharing with you why it is fundamental for countries to have this wealth of information, why it is fundamental to produce time use data and calculate time use statistics to answer all sorts of a variety of public policies and respond to many research questions. We will also touch on the current status of available data and what countries are doing to make sure that they produce this information, some of the challenges that countries are facing, and that will lead us nicely to talk about the work that we are doing in New York with many of the colleagues that actually are in the room with us and with many technical experts from national statistical offices to make sure that countries can rely on lighter solutions, lighter tools, modern tools that will enable them to produce this data in a more regular and timely manner. Next, thank you, Iliana. But let me start from the beginning. Again, I don't know the level of knowledge on time use surveys and time use statistics in the room. So just to set the stage, time use statistics are quantitative summaries of how people are spending their time. So usually we look at the 24 hours of a given day, and we ask them to report what they are doing in a very tiny time slots. Usually it's 10 or 15 minutes if the instrument that they are using is a diary. Based on that, we get all this very valuable information on the activities they are engaged in, how much time they spend on each of these activities, usually out of a classification of activities that has been agreed with the country, and much more. There is all sorts of probing questions giving us the context in which these activities are taking place. So we ask them where they were when the activity took place, with whom, with the children, with friends, with colleagues. We ask them if this activity was paid or not. So a lot of information that is collected together with the type of activity itself. Next. So, but why are we promoting the production of time use statistics across countries? There is a lot of literature out there, but just in a nutshell, we usually group the research questions that can be answered from time use surveys and the public policies that can be informed with this wealth of data into three groups. So group one is really being able to answer to questions related to quality of life, work-life balance, and general well-being. So by being able to know how much time you spend in paid work, and if you spend too much time at work, then maybe you are left with a little time for socializing or for sleeping, knowing that probably you also have some committed time at home, taking care of your kids and taking care of the elderly living with you. So it gives you an overall trade-off of all these activities in a given 24 hours, how you can make the best out of this time that is an equalizer. We all have the same amount of time in a given day. So that's group number one, I would say, the reasons behind producing time use statistics. There is a lot of interest also for decades now on producing time use statistics to measure what we call unpaid work and have a better sense, a better estimate of the economic contribution of women and men. So we call it in short unpaid work, and that contains all those activities related to taking care of your children at home, taking care of other adults at home, but also the domestic chores. So the technical statistical term, it's the provision of unpaid household services for your family or your household. And then the third chapter, the third group of reasons, I would say, to produce time use data and time use statistics is the two above, but from a gender lens. So time use statistics, time use surveys as a great fundamental source of information to answer all sorts of questions on gender equality and inform policies related to specific gender concerns. That brings me to zooming in into goal 5 of the SDGs framework, where you may probably already know that we have a dedicated target 5.4, that is actually really looking at recognizing and valuing unpaid care and domestic work, what I called in short unpaid work. And that is matched with indicator 5.4.1 that we will keep repeating in the next slides. We are a co-custodian of that indicator, so it's very important and a priority in our work here in New York, where again the countries have committed to measure and monitor the time spent on unpaid domestic and care work, and to provide the data disaggregated by sex, because there is a very important gender dimension there, by age and by location. Next. Just quickly, I trust that these numbers are already clear and you're familiar with them because they haven't changed over time. Women do most of this unpaid work, unpaid domestic and care work, and according to the latest numbers, we are still this almost 3 times as much as men. So women spend almost 3 times as much time spent by men on this unpaid work. And if we go the extra step, if we move from the metric of time to the monetary value of this time, and there are techniques, statistical techniques that we are not going to cover here to do that extra step, then these productive activities, this very valuable time corresponds to something like 20 to 60% of GDP of countries that have done this extra step. And we have information for around 40 countries in the world that have done the valuation of unpaid domestic and care work. Next. Quickly, also the last point I wanted to make, because these are colleagues also from the country teams. You are all familiar with the Secretary General, our common agenda report, where there is a call for us collectively to come up with new measures of progress, new metrics that would really capture what matters to people and the planet. So the initiative that I'm mentioning is the Beyond GDP. And us, and again, it's a big us, we think that this indicator 5.4.1, focusing on the time spent on unpaid work, would be the perfect companion to complement GDP for many reasons. The most important is that this is already an agreed indicator. It's already part of the framework. Member states have already committed to measure and monitor it. And for many other reasons, including that if we move to the value, so not just the metric time, but we also put a dollar value to this time, the methods that have been agreed are completely in line with the methods that are behind the estimation of the GDP. So the two numbers would really go well hand in hand. Next. Just the last couple of slides from my side, and then Iliana will pick it up. We wanted to give you a sense of what's going on at the country level. Data availability has increased drastically over the past 20 years or so. So if you look at the timeline, we start in the 60s, where there is only 3 countries, all centered in Europe. And then over the decades, more countries have picked up. There was a much stronger interest in producing this data. And I hope that we also have a role in this, because in the early 2000s, we produced the UN Statistics Division with all our partners, including UNICEF. We produced the first set of guidelines. So it's a handbook presenting the tools and explaining the how to produce the data. That was 2005, and currently what Iliana will present shortly is an update. It's the work to update that set of guidelines. We also develop the international classification for activities on time use statistics, ICATUS. That's the international standard on how to classify the time that you get from a time use survey. So in total, now we can rely on 92 countries with this information. On one hand, we are very happy. There is a much better distribution in terms of regions and a variety of countries, both with developed systems as well as not so developed. So that's something we celebrate. At the same time, 92 is very far from 193. We would like all member states to have this type of information for all the reasons that I mentioned above. And my last slide. Please click, click, click. So we have 92 countries. Half of the countries have been able actually to produce the data more than once, and that's critically important because it's about measuring, but it's also about monitoring. So you need multiple data collections to be able to compare if you are going into the right direction. And the why only 92? It's because these data come from very heavy type of, traditionally very heavy type of household surveys, time use surveys, particularly if they are dedicated time use surveys, relying on a diary format. They give you on one hand this super granular data, very high quality with a lot of potential in terms of use, as per above, what I said above, but on the other hand, they're very expensive. They require huge investments in terms of human and financial resources, and they come with a quite heavy respondents burden. And knowing that all household surveys are now facing this increase or decrease in response rates, countries are, looking around for other options to move away from the traditional time use survey, and they ask us to come up with lighter solutions using innovations, using modern methods to ensure that countries still have the resources and the capacity to keep producing these important data sets. Or if they have never done it, they want lighter solutions to make sure that they can convince their decision makers that this is important and they should produce time use data and statistics. I think this is my last, Iliana, and you take over from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. So now I'm going to provide a brief summary of the work on time use that the division is supporting. This is a timeline, and I believe that you are going to share the slides. So everything here is hyperlinked for you to get access to the documents, which contain more detailed information on the methodological instruments I'm going to present. As Francesca mentioned, in the last 20 years, there was more countries producing time use data, and this is also because of the Beijing Declaration and Plan for Action that calls for the development of an activity classification for time use statistics. And because of that, the methodological works that surrounded the time use data, it has always been developed with a gender lens, which is important. And as Francesca mentioned, also more and more the value of time use has been acknowledged for many other uses, not only for gender equality as well. So I'm not gonna read everything here, but probably I'm going to share with you a little bit about ICATUS, which is the short for the International Classification on Time Use Activities. The first trial version was presented as an annex to the guide on 2005, and it took several years to publish it in 2016 and being endorsed by the Statistical Commission in 2017 as an international standard. But this length review guarantee that many experts, not only on time use, but also gender statisticians, classification experts on national accounts, labor statisticians around the world, review this instrument to make sure that the classification will serve different purposes. ICATUS is a hierarchical classification of all possible activities undertaken by the general population during a specific period of time, generally 24 hours in a day, but there are activities that are not daily based, but probably you do it every couple of days or every couple of weeks. So all possible activities are listed there. It's organized in 9 major divisions that has 165 activities. And it's consistent with the SNA, to, as Francesca was mentioning, to allow the calculation of aggregates for satellite accounts, meaning that one major component of this classification is identifying those activities that are within the production boundaries, meaning activities that the major outcome of the activity is to produce goods or services for final use or for the use of others or exchange in the market, and activities that are not productive or for personal use, like taking a shower, education activities, socializing activities. So this is the first major classification that allows comparison with the national accounts. Another important thing is that the expert group dedicated to produce this classification had experts from different countries. So to ensure that this classification is comparable with existing time use classifications at different regions and also national classifications on time use, is aligned with the resolution concerning statistics on work, employment, and labor underutilization adopted by the 19th International Conference of Labor Statisticians in 2013, because also these statistics are being used to measure all forms of work, not only those that were traditionally measured by labor force surveys for employment, but also those activities that are done by households and are not interchanged in the market. And finally, it provides a framework to produce meaningful and comparable statistics on time use across countries and over time. After the endorsement of ICATUS, it was also the Statistical Commission welcomed this classification, but it called for more guidance on how to implement the classification at the national level. So an expert group on the long name is the Expert Group on Innovative and Effective Ways to Collect Time Use Statistics. We call ICATUS internally, and the objective is to improve national capacities in producing comprehensive time use data that meet international standards and use the latest technologies. This means that the idea is to produce a set of guidance to promote international comparability, but at the same time to increase the frequency of data collections as well as the number of countries that are producing this type of data. As Francesca mentioned, there are several challenges that countries are facing, and the idea is to produce less rigid recommendations, but rather a basket of options that can be adapted to different national contexts and different needs. To ensure that countries are producing more data on time use. So the objective will be to present to the Statistical Commission in 2024 a revised version of the guides for production of time use statistics. In the meantime, from the creation of the expert group up to 2024, several intermediate products have been already presented to the Statistical Commission. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of them. In 2020, and you have the link in the slides, there was a document on policy relevance, because also countries have recognized that sometimes, even though these surveys are very difficult to carry out, the use of this data has not been in accordance to the investment to produce it. So many countries probably produce the data and only use it to report indicator 541, but the data is very rich and you can inform different type of policies. So this document is making the case of time use data, and it was aligned to the framework of the SDG monitoring to ensure that not only indicator 541 for gender equality, but many other indicators can be informed with time use data. Also, it was important to agree on concepts and definitions so everyone understands what we are talking about. So there's a document as well on key definitions and terms used when working on time use data and time use surveys to promote consistent and harmonized terminology. Two documents, one in 2020 and one in 2022 about quality considerations. I'm gonna briefly talk about this. And two modernization documents the production of time use statistics, and just to say that modernization is a journey that might have different meaning for different countries. For some countries, it will mean to move from paper-based diaries, for example, to computer-assisted diaries in the process of modernizing national statistical systems. So we are not promoting to invest more in these technologies, but rather utilize whatever the National Statistical Office is already using for other statistical processes. And for other countries, it might mean combining different modes, probably using advantage of latest technologies to capture time use information. So it's very broad, but it's, as I said before, gives the opportunity to countries to adapt the time use surveys to their national context. And finally, the heart of these guidelines will be the minimum harmonized instrument, which is a minimum set of activities. And when we talk about minimum harmonized instrument, we are not promoting for those countries that have the richer information to lower their standards, but rather to have an agreement on which is the lowest minimum set of activities that will ensure comparability among countries and also comparability among different points in time. The instrument also provides a minimum set of background information, both for classifying correctly activities, but also for purposes of analyzing the time use information. And in addition to that, it also brings two model questionnaires, one using stylized surveys or questions, and I'm gonna show you a little bit what those look like, and another promoting the use of live diaries. So let me go to, how the guidelines are going to look. We're probably, as I said before, not going to give just one solution that fit all contexts, but rather list of methodological decisions that national statistical offices might need to consider. And those methodological decisions are both linked to the needs, but also the resources that the statistical office might have. So I'm not going into all these details because it's very, very rich. But for example, the first methodological decision is whether you will produce a standalone survey, meaning a dedicated survey for the purpose of collecting time use, or to include it as a module of a continuous survey in the country, like it can be the LFS or the mix or any other survey that the country is already doing. So how it will look like, the methodological decisions will have some advantages, but also some limitations, and we are going to highlight the advantages and the limitations in the guidelines, so the statistical office is aware of the resources that it might need, but also the limitations that their decision will have at the end, which each of these methodological decisions. And for the quality considerations, we understand that there are underlying principles that apply to all household surveys that are relevant also for time use surveys, like the United Nations National Quality Assurance Frameworks and also the generic statistical business process models. So using these two frameworks, the guidelines will in each chapter highlight those particular aspects of quality that are relevant to time use. And at the end of each chapter, you will have like a checklist to revise whether all the components of quality have been taken care of. And the minimum harmonized instrument, I'm trying to go fast here. When and why use it? It's for more frequent collections, meaning that sometimes these standalone surveys, the big ones with long diaries, might not be as frequent as we want. Many countries have been doing it every 10 years. So for collections in between these 10 years, it's always an alternative to have a lighter instrument, or as a starting point for countries that have never collected time use data is also a good alternative. I already mentioned the background characteristics of the household and the individuals, which is presented in the documents that the group has already produced and published, and a list of 25 activities covering a 24-hour period that are presented as a set of standardized questions, but also as a light diary survey option. And it also has corresponding tables for the activities between the minimum harmonized instrument, ICATUS, HETUS, and CAUTAL for Latin America and the Caribbean countries. This is how the minimum list of activities look like. And this is in words classification wording, but we also have the same list with more common wording that can be adapted, for example, for the standardized questions or the diaries. I don't think I have the slide here, but you might find it also in the document. And from activity 4 to activity 12, these are the activities that need to be collected in order to compute indicator 541, which, as Francesca mentioned, are those activities related to domestic chores, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the dwelling, and also those activities related to the care of other household or family members, children, adults, or people with disabilities or sick in the family. And yeah, to finalize, this is how the guidelines will look. It will have the minimum harmonized instrument, quality criteria, and also some recommendations on how to use modern technologies to make more efficient these data collections. And I leave you with some sources for deep in this information. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca and Iliana. Let's move on to the second segment of our webinar, and I will leave the floor to Lauren and Eva. The floor is yours, guys. Go ahead.
Thank you, Attila. And thank you so much, Francesca and Iliana, for the really rich overview of the methodological work UNSD has led to measure time use. I should note that when we began thinking about measuring children's time use at UNICEF several years ago, Francesca and her team were really pivotal in helping us think through how the processes and the standards could be adapted to children. So the work that Eva and I will present has really benefited from their knowledge and expertise. So this quote you see on the slides is over 20 years old, but I return to it often because I think it really succinctly captures what we're aiming to do here. So in short, before we can evaluate how well children are doing and why some are doing better than others, it is important to understand what they are doing, with whom, and in which social context and institutions. And this is really at the heart of MIX and our efforts to develop a children's time use module for inclusion in the next round, MIX 7. Next slide, please. So more specifically, there's really a knowledge gap. We have limited understanding about how the way that children spend their time affects their well-being and shapes their opportunities. As Francesca and Iliana said, time use is quite relevant to monitoring SDG 5 on gender equality. I should note it's International Women's Day, so a happy International Women's Day to you all. But that time use data collection has largely focused on the adult population, even though we do know that gender disparities in time use begin to form in childhood, both related to unpaid domestic and care work, as Francesca and Iliana noted, but also other ways in which children spend their time, such as in school, on homework, in leisure and play, etc. But despite this importance, there are actually no standard data collection tools to measure children's time use. Next slide. So time use data on children, as for adults, comprise the activities children engage in and their duration or the amount of time they spend on the activity. Key activities of relevance to children would include playing, socializing, learning, sleeping, eating, etc. The headline indicators that we can derive from children's time use data include the participation rate or the proportion of children engaged in an activity, as well as the mean time spent on the activity, either among all children, whether or not they are actually engaged in the activity, or conditional on their participation in the activity. In addition to these indicators, time use data allows us to develop a profile of a child's day so that we can understand how an average child spends their day, what they are doing, for how long, with whom, and how this profile may vary based on key socio-demographic characteristics such as age, sex, household wealth, etc. Next slide, please. So as Francesca and Iliana touched upon, there are two main instruments for collecting time use data. The first is the use of a stylized set of questions for a specific reference period, usually either the past 7 days or 24 hours. So in this approach, the respondent may be asked, for example, in the past 7 days, how much time did you spend doing homework? So the question is quite easy to administer for the interviewer or enumerator, but it really places a high cognitive burden on the respondent. Because taking this example, the respondent must properly identify the activities. So, okay, the question's asking about homework. So now I have to think, I actually did some of my homework at school. Is this considered to be homework since technically it was done at school? I was studying for a test. The teacher didn't assign the studying to me, but I studied anyway. Can this be considered homework? So they have to properly identify what we actually mean when we ask about homework. They also need to properly identify the reference period. Okay, the interviewer asked about the last 7 days. So working backwards, that takes me to last Tuesday. No, it's last Wednesday. Then once they've got those two things down, they have to think about all of the different episodes or times that they actually spent doing homework. They then have to allocate the amount of time to each of those episodes. Okay, Tuesday I spent 20 minutes doing homework. Wednesday it was 45. And then finally, once they have all of that, they have to aggregate all the instances into a frequency estimate. So clearly this can be a lot to ask of respondents, particularly children and adolescents. A second approach that alleviates some of this burden is the time diary. Time diaries can be self-administered or survey-based, that is administered by the interviewer. A self-administered approach might entail the respondent completing a paper-based diary that the interviewer leaves at the household and then comes back to collect, or it could be a web-based diary, for example. Self-reported time diaries, as you might guess, require a high level of literacy, numeracy, and in some cases, technological savvy, and as a result are likely not suitable in many of the contexts in which mix is implemented. In a diary administered by an interviewer, the interviewer walks the respondent through the past 24 hours to collect information on both the activities the respondent did and the time spent on them. So it's really a facilitated conversation between the enumerator and the respondent. So for example, you might ask, what time did you wake up yesterday? And the respondent reports 7 a.m. What did you do upon waking? I had breakfast. For how long did you spend eating? About 20 minutes. What did you do next? I got ready for work, and so on and so on, so that at the end of the data collection, the full 24-hour period is accounted for. This approach is less cognitively burdensome for the respondent and yields a complete profile of how the respondent spends their day, but also requires a great deal of training of the enumerators. Next slide, please. So regardless of the approach, there are challenges to time use data collection that must be grappled with. Francesca and Iliana focused on some of these. Here, in the interest of time, I will highlight the issue of seasonality bias. So the information collected on time use is really a snapshot that is not able to encompass the annual seasonal variations in different activities that respondents engage in, such as activities related to the agricultural season or the school year. So there's really no easy solution for mitigating seasonality bias. Ideally, the time use data should be collected at multiple times for each respondent to ensure coverage across seasons, but this is of course not realistic for most survey programs, nor for mix. And then, as I talked about briefly, there's some other challenges related to the high cognitive burden of respondents or the need for highly skilled interviewers, which Ava will illuminate based on our field test in a little bit. Next slide. So there are also challenges specific to children's time use data collection, most notably whom to interview. Can and should the data be self-reported by the child or adolescent, as is the gold standard with time use data collection for adults? Or should the information be collected by proxy, typically the primary caregiver, often the mother? So two issues are at play here. The first is social desirability bias. Are caregivers more likely to underreport activities that they may consider undesirable, such as spending too much time on work activities? Or in contrast, overreport desirable activities, such as the amount of time that a child may engage in school-related activities, such as actually attending school or doing homework, etc. So there's some evidence to suggest that mothers underreport girls' domestic work in particular, but other evidence suggests this bias decreases with the age of the girl, as it's considered more socially okay for older girls to spend time on domestic work. The second issue vis-a-vis self versus proxy reporting is the accuracy of the caregiver's ability to report the activities and time spent for the child. Do they know what the child is doing and for how long? For adolescents, we can expect, maybe if we think about our own lives, that as adolescents, begin to spend more time outside of the household, away from the primary caregiver, it becomes increasingly difficult for the caregiver to report by proxy the activities and the time spent on them for the adolescents. And then, of course, we have to grapple with at what age can we expect children to be cognitively able to report their own time use? Eurostat has suggested that children as young as 8 and 10 can report their own time use, but to what extent does this hold true in the low and middle income countries in which mix is implemented? A review of the literature suggests that time use instruments are typically completed by a parent or caregiver of children 12 years or younger, or sometimes in collaboration with them, which has been done in Australia, and by children ages 13 to 17 themselves. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean for mixed data collection on children's time use? We see real value in integrating a children's time use module into MIX because, as you know, MIX surveys currently collect data on a range of outcomes on children's lives and their living conditions, including data time spent on household chores and economic activities to measure child labor. With the development of a full time use module to capture the type and duration of all activities children engage in, information will be available to assess how patterns in children's time use differ by age and sex, and the characteristics you see listed here, whether individual or household or environmental, and correlate with outcomes in children's well-being. To really assess the impact, on their well-being, including girls' disproportionate time spent on unpaid care burdens, as well as how this can engage, as well as how this data can inform and give us a better understanding of children's lives and can inform more effective policy and programming on children, which is at the heart, obviously, of UNICEF's work. So I'm going to turn it over to Ava now to talk us through the field test activities that we've engaged in, what we've learned from them, and then next steps moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren. Okay, so when MIX started considering the integration of data collection and time use, we had conducted a review of existing practices, the existing literature, methods, and we identified a range of issues that we knew we needed to learn more about, we needed to test. So here's a list of the issues that we wanted to address through field testing. The first one being the choice between stylized questions and a time diary design. There are some stylized questions already in MIX, specifically collecting data on children's involvement, engagement in work-related activities, our child labor module. And so we wanted to see how it would, if it would be possible to sort of like follow that same design to collect data more broadly on time use. We also needed to look at the issue of who to interview, and I'm not going to get into the details because Lauren covered that in detail. And we realized also we needed to adapt the ICATUS list of activities to be more suitable for children. We also considered inclusion of contextual questions to understand better in what situations children engage in what type of activities. And also look at some issues that are relevant for multi-topic surveys like MIX. What is the additional respondent burden of adding this module to MIX? Are there any complexities associated with enumerator training, etc.? Now, through the testing process, we had to look at different guiding criteria. The first one is that we wanted to develop a module or a tool, an instrument that would be relevant across a diversity of settings, but also that would be relevant for programming. We understood from the beginning that this is a tool or data collection that is complex and in its administration. And so we knew that we would have to face a trade-off between getting a lot of detail and granular information and developing an instrument that would not be too complex in terms of codification of activities and training of enumerators. The final, guiding criteria for us was to, was it feasible? I mean, we needed to find a way or an approach to get quality data without adversely affecting the overall quality of mixed data. Now, this is an overview of the different field testing exercises that we've conducted over the years. I wanted to say maybe that just, what's relevant to know is that these field tests were not dedicated or, exclusively to children's time use. These were field tests and exercises that included the testing of other mixed modules. And so there were it was a combination of opportunities, and especially during the pandemic period where it was extremely difficult to go to the field and do any testing of any kind, we had to size, on opportunities for us. And so there are some limitations in terms of the design of these instruments, and we'll speak about this later. But I wanted to mention that in Malawi, for example, we did focus on the testing of stylized questions with 2 reference periods, 7 days and 24 hours. In Belize, we moved on to testing the survey-based time diary, not like the self-administered, but the time diary administered by an interviewer. We already work on an initial adaptation of the ICATUS activities to prioritize children's activities. And in Zimbabwe, we further adapted those activities and also introduced contextual questions. In terms of the reporting, we focused on, for the first 2 field tests, we administered this instrument to the primary caregivers of children between the ages of 5 and 17. But in the last field test in Zimbabwe, we already looked at, we tried to address this issue of self-report versus proxy report. And we interviewed adolescents directly, age 15 to 17, and also their caregivers. And these tests were mostly qualitative. And it were conducted in close collaboration with UNICEF in these countries and with the national statistical offices. Now, so what have we learned from this, over these last few years of testing? So I'll start with the Malawi testing of the stylized questions, and briefly to say that the 24-hour recall was clearly designed that was easier for respondents, and what we confirm it was that the stylized questions require detailed probing for accurate reporting and a lot of assistance from interviewers to aggregate the information, especially over the 1 week period, as Lauren has already discussed. We also observed respondent fatigue, potentially owing to this cognitive burden of retrieval and aggregation of information. And here we have a quote from the interviewer briefing that speaks to that respondent fatigue. Now, also as expected, we've learned that it is difficult to collect accurate time-related information in settings where keeping track of time is not necessarily like a priority, or in low literacy settings where people have challenges or with estimation of time. And then we got, of course, non-numeric responses, like, for example, not long bit that require time estimation after extensive probing. Here's another quote to illustrate some of these challenges in rural areas in Malawi. But in general, we wanted to highlight that respondents across all of these settings and over these years were pleased to speak about their day or their child's day. So that is not necessarily an issue or a challenge. In terms of the proxy versus self-report, what we've learned so far is, and just to reiterate some of the points that Lauren made earlier, caregivers may not be able to report their child's activities and the duration, especially when the child is away from home, right? Caregivers found it harder than adolescents in our latest field test in Zimbabwe to report accurately on the activities that their adolescents were engaged in. And now preliminary results from Zimbabwe show differences in proxy versus self-report, but the extent and the meaning of these differences needs to be further assessed. Okay. In terms of the time diary, what we've learned is, again, interviewing techniques differ for time diary administration, differ from the typical survey. The administration and the interviewing techniques that are typically used for the average survey questions, because it's not a scripted set of questions, but rather a facilitated conversation. It is important, right, that we have very skilled interviewers facilitating that interaction. Now, the chronological reporting, we found that helps with the respondents' recall and does not seem too time-consuming based on our average interview times that we've recorded in our field tests. However, again, it's still complex, and probing is needed to avoid gaps in the accounting of activities. Especially something that is challenging is identifying the main activity when simultaneous activities are being reported. For example, eating while watching TV or socializing while maybe running an errand, going to a store to buy something. So CAPI, what we've learned is also that CAPI can minimize errors, especially when it comes to time estimation and with the relevant prompts and consistency checks. But also we know that, and we've seen that it can interfere with the interview's flow and the interviewer's performance. And this is not unique to time use diaries, but it's because of its added complexity. We do need to, interviewers are very familiar and they can easily interact with the CAPI entry application so that that doesn't disrupt the flow of the interview. So in conclusion, we realize quality data on time use, right, depends on what interviewer respondent report and a strong interviewing skills. But we see that with adequate training and practice, interviewers' skills in probing and coding of activities can significantly improve. The materials for training and the manuals need to really be customized to provide examples that are relevant for, in each setting to help with the coding of activities. And something that may seem obvious is, but it can be a challenge, especially in multi-topic surveys like MIX, is that sufficient time needs to be allocated to training on this module. And I say this because obviously in a multi-topic survey like MIX, we have very long training, enumerators, interviewers training that are packed with a lot of content, and it is always a challenge, right? And to allocate enough and sufficient time for practice and training. But this is critical, and we've seen this in our field tests of this module. Then finally, in terms of some of the lessons we've learned, as an important part of the process for testing and these time diaries is that, as mentioned, we wanted to develop an instrument that would be meaningful for children, and that involved reclassification and regrouping of ICATUS domain activities, a required introduction of new activity labels, so that we could prioritize children's activities. It's not that ICATUS obviously covers children, but is not necessarily specific to children. So for us to be able to capture better some of the emerging issues that affect children's lives and, align better with UNICEF programming, we introduced some new labels. For example, school attendance, right? We know now a modality for school attendance is remote school attendance. So that now is reflected in our activities in the children's time use module. We're also capturing gaming separately from other forms of playing. Socialization in person versus socialization through digital technologies or using digital technologies is now also something that is seen like separate, just because of the increasing prevalence of these and exposure of children to digital and online engagement. Social media as entertainment is also something that we wanted to capture in this module. So at the end of the day, this is a trade-off between obviously the granularity and the level of detail of the information we're collecting and the complexity that this brings to coding of activities and interviewers training. And so we had to really strike a balance between these two, and in some cases we had to group activities that maybe weren't so much of a priority for children in our understanding, and in other cases we had to develop and create subcategories and new labels for activities that we wanted to capture separately. Now, the introduction of context, we also introduced contextual questions related to specifically tutoring and homework and after school hours, and some questions about online engagement associated with activities, learning activities, socialization activities, and civic participation. And this we did in the last field test. In general, the activities, the adaptation of the ICATUS activities, as well as the contextual questions work well and were well understood. But one limitation of our field tests is that the sample sizes were relatively small, and we're not able to capture variation in some of these low prevalence activities because of the testing locations where we did the testing. So finally, what's next? So the mixed program is now readying the module to be made available as a complementary topic in Mix 7 during the course of this year. And this is going to include a tool package that will also include administration guidelines, interviewers' instructions, and protocols and ethical considerations for interviewing children and adolescents. We're considering direct report starting from age 12 or 13 with caregivers report for children younger than that age. And then as also next step, we're planning to publish a methodological report that will summarize, the process, the testing process, and the key findings from the qualitative and quantitative analysis of the field test data. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks indeed to all the presenters. Thank you very much. I'm checking the chat box. I don't see any questions or comments at this point. So I will try to break the virtual ice myself to start with a couple of questions, one to colleagues from UNST and one to my colleagues in UNICEF. To colleagues, to Francesca and Iliana. The SDG indicator is specifically on time spent on unpaid domestic and care work by sex and other disaggregates. I wonder if there had been any other consideration to go broader than just unpaid domestic and care work at the time when SDGs were being formulated, the indicators. Because the time use surveys obviously collect much richer information on time use on other activities. And to UNICEF colleagues, what I'm wondering if and when we include the time use module in the 5 to 17 questionnaires in the mix, the conversation, the issue at hand is so natural to learn about someone's activities the previous day that what would be the placement of this module in the questionnaires? Initial thinking. Is there initial thinking on that one? But let's start with Francesca and Iliana.
Iliana, maybe I start and then you jump in. So thanks for the question, Attila. To my knowledge, that was the only indicator based clearly based on time use data that made the final list. And we know why. I mean, there is no question that when we talk about unpaid as a service work, unpaid domestic chores, unpaid caregiving, people automatically understand that we need to have a time use survey or a module attached to an ongoing survey. So there is a clear connection between measuring unpaid work and the production of time use data. However, Iliana mentioned a positioning paper that was prepared by this expert group that has been working with us for many years that make the case for using time use surveys to measure and monitor many other indicators that are in the SDG framework. So there is no direct mention to time and time use in those labels, in those indicators, but those indicators can be populated through data that you collect from time use surveys. So we explain the link and the matching between what you get from a time use diary in particular and how those data could feed into your 231 indicators in the SDG framework. That's one. And at the same time, we are really positioning ourselves, thinking of the beyond 2030, I shouldn't say it, but definitely beyond GDP, and that was my slide in the context of our common agenda and the call for new metrics that will accompany, that will supplement, complement GDP. We believe that a metric based on time, that's an equalizer. We all have only 24 hours. Particularly this indicator that has already been agreed by member states, I'm talking about the 5.4.1, we believe that would be the perfect companion to disseminate, produce and disseminate together with the GDP. So there is a lot of potential for this data as we move along. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Iliana, anything to add on this point?
Not just to say that there are some countries that have been using the data, for example, to measure multidimensional aspects of poverty for that to complement indicators on SDG 1 based on time use data, also for monitoring education and health. But as an international community, we haven't agreed on indicators based on time use to monitor SDGs or any other common agenda that we might have. I will place the link to the positioning paper in the chat, so if you want to have more information.
I see a question coming up in the chat box, but before I go to Shane's question, I think, let me turn to Lauren and Eva on the question that I posed to them.
Okay, that's a tricky question, Attila. But
I know.
Yeah, I will say that I think a couple of considerations. Of course, we are in the process of looking at this issue where best, and vis-a-vis who do we administer this module to, right? So currently in the questionnaire for children between 5 and 17, we do have already a module that is administered directly to children, which is the foundational learning skills module. And this basically we start with an we build break the ice with the child. We ask a few questions. We administer a reading and math short assessment. So now if we are going to be interviewing children between the ages, and this module is administered to children between 7 and 14. So if the time use module, if we make the decision to administer directly this to also children, say, starting from age 12, I mean, ideally, we want to, sort of do this either before or after. My sense is that it would be maybe before, so that maybe we can, that could be like as a warm up and in the interaction with the child. But when we are interviewing the caregiver for children younger than that age, then one thing we need to consider is the placement vis-a-vis our current child labor module, because it seems like a natural, respondents are already in that mode of thinking about the activities that they engage in. The child labor module is looking at the past 7 days, and so maybe the natural thing would be to narrow down on more, shorter period of time, the last day. But we also need to look at in the field test where we administer both the child labor and the time use diary, how does that work? So to inform our final decision on this. But I think those would be the two main considerations. And I think, I think different options have different advantages, but definitely, as you said, it's an easy topic. It's not a controversial one. It's not a difficult one. It's not asking about, their mental health, or it's not about, so it is something that could be used, I think, for building rapport between the interviewer and the respondent, especially for children. And we said our experiences like that, the respondents like talking about this topic. So not a difficult one, but yeah.
Yeah, Lauren, anything to add on this point?
I mean, just to build on, it might be interesting to know that in Zimbabwe, we tested this along a brand new first-time tested module on measuring gender norms, which is a complex topic, as well as a more developed module on adolescent mental health. And so, particularly could be potentially sensitive or onerous modules in and of themselves. So just to say, yes, when we asked about the time use, you could see sort of a relaxation among the respondents. And I do think it does require rapport building with the enumerator because it is that facilitated conversation. But I do think it has the ability to be integrated, anywhere once we really figured out whom we're asking these questions of and of what age. And just, it does relate to Shane's question about the overlap with the child labor. We specifically did integrate the child labor module in both Belize and Zimbabwe to try to understand better, if we've asked questions about children's time spent on unpaid domestic and care work in the child labor module, and then ask them about the time diary. So more broadly, how they spend their time, our respondent is going to say, why are you asking me these questions again, or be confused or annoyed? And we did not find that. We thought, at least from these two field tests, that it actually worked rather well, and there wasn't any of that sort of adverse response over.
Thanks, Lauren. I hope that answers Shane's question as well, the overlap. I know that you guys have been dealing with that overlap, and we've been doing some thinking on that. We don't have that many other places in the questionnaire where we refer to time used by respondents on anything, any activity, basically. So that has been a challenge. So I go to Ranto's question, which is about the day of interview. That's another thing that we have been grappling with. I know you have been grappling with. Maybe that's also a question for colleagues in UNSD too, about time use surveys and the day when the information is collected for the last one day, and the day during which you were doing the interview would make a difference, of course. So how do time use surveys deal with that in general? What is the thinking on the mix side? Francesca, we can start with you.
Okay, of course, Iliana is the real expert in the room, but my understanding is that some countries at least, that have the tradition of collecting this information over the years, they actually stay in the field for a full year. So they tackle the issue of seasonality by making sure that they have enough day diaries that cover the 365 days. And of course, that's not an option for mix. That's not feasible. We know that other countries, more in developing settings, they would pick enough time in the field to cover for some seasonality elements. If it's Ramadan, either they stay away completely from that time, except if the objective of the survey is to really understand the difference in how people spend their time in Ramadan settings and outside. So of course, if that's the objective, they would try to get a portion of Ramadan as well as beyond. So it really depends on the objective behind the data collection, I think. But the spectrum is stay in the field for the full year, to maybe a month of diary days, making sure that they would capture some of the seasonality. Thank you. Iliana, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, and also the idea is to allocate the sample in different days of the week. So in some countries it's feasible because it's possible to take interviewers to the field the 7 days of a week. In other countries, this might not work, and then the reference day for the diary might be a little bit away from the day of the interview. So this seasonality issue puts a lot of challenges to field procedures as well. But many countries have been trying to deal with this by allocating the sample in different days of the week, trying to make sure that all days of the week are equally represented in the final data.
Thanks, Francesca and Iliana. Eva, Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, yes, I mean, challenging. That's not something we can do, like allocate, certain, days of the week, like, that's not, I mean, obviously the mixed data collection period covers like probably around 2-3 months in the field, which should allow for some variation in seasonality. But obviously there are periods when we know, and especially thinking about children, right? We need, I think in the customization process, in the survey planning process, I think this is something that teams will need to look at, specifically in their context, and looking at the list of activities that are prioritized for children. What do they think? Are there any seasonal issues that might affect, responses? So, for example, schools, right? If you conduct your field work during, when schools are off in between school years, and that school break is very long, then that's going to have a significant impact on the time use of children, because this is such a central activity for most children. It could be also, so, as much as possible, avoid, right, collecting data during that, major school break period. Obviously, there will be some shorter school break periods, like maybe of a week or so in between trimesters. Maybe that's okay, right? And because, you expect that, there will be like the distribution of the days and the period in a mixed sample maybe are going to help with limiting the bias. And in a way it's also good. And we can do an analysis by children during school breaks. Maybe we're looking at different types of activities and allocation of time to different types of activities. So I think that could also yield some interesting information. So yeah, I think we will have to provide, and to answer Ranto's question about specific instructions, we will have to, and there will be some guidance on this, especially at the stages of planning and I want to say it's not technically customization of the tool, but yes, during the planning, because it's going to have more of an impact than other modules in Mix, I think, for the planning of the Mix. I don't know, Lauren, maybe, is there anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, yes, we've been discussing this for quite a while, and it's, I think, one of the biggest challenges of integrating a time use module into a multi-purpose existing household survey, that you don't have the luxury to tweak or amend the parameters of the overall survey. And so, it's on our mind, and guidance does have to be developed. And there are examples of countries that don't randomly select a diary day, such as South Africa and others. So I think there is some precedent there, and we will reach out to the expert group on time use as well to help us, of which UNICEF is a member, to help us sort through this issue. Over.
Thank you very much. Well, there's the day of the week, there's the seasonality issues, but there's also special circumstances like we had during COVID and lockdowns. And a good question from Haugen is, What about any data research on how time use changed during COVID-related school closures and lockdowns? Is there anything in the literature on this? I remember seeing some literature about changing sleep patterns of kids during lockdown, etc. But I'm no expert, so I'm going to forward the question to you guys.
Okay, we follow the same circle. So yes, there is a lot of literature, and we actually developed as a group, this expert group that Lauren referred to, and UNICEF is a key player there. We put together a lightest instrument to produce data on time use during the COVID pandemic. It's based on a set of questions, and the purpose is not really to come up with prevalence, with indicators, averages, etc., of what people are doing per se, but more to be able to compare with pre-COVID. So it's to measure and track the change, what has changed because of this new context. And a few countries have been using it. We know that other countries were already checking and testing other instruments. So there is quite a lot of information on what happened in terms of time use during the pandemic. We would be happy to maybe write, Iliana, on the side, the links to this material for our colleagues to study afterwards. Thank you. So it was more about the tracking change rather than...
Yeah, just to add, I mean, yeah, I know UN Women during the pandemic engaged in rapid data collection, so not representative samples, but to try to understand changes again in time use during the pandemic for adults as well as for older children. And then in Zimbabwe, we actually, that was one of the changes I think Ava had referenced, where we asked about time spent in remote learning. Given, you know, this obviously newly identified need during the pandemic when schools in most countries shut down and switched over to remote-based learning. So, you know, we felt that we should take advantage of the opportunity to try to integrate those questions into the Zimbabwe field test to see how they would work. Because of the pandemic itself, the data collection was actually delayed. So by the time we got to the field in summer of 2022, so just this past summer, you know, all schools had resumed in-person learning again. So we weren't able to yield data on, you know, actual time spent, but we did get a sense of, you know, how did those questions work, at least for the respondents, with the idea being that in the context of another crisis, we would be able to pivot or implement those questions as needed. Over.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting contribution from Idrissa in the chat box saying that they are running a data collection for evaluation now, and then the fact that it coincided with school times, it has been hard to fill adolescents questionnaires, which is a problem, which may be a problem for many data collection activities depending on the context. I see another contribution from Jay, and I'm going to read it. Is there any plan to collect additional information about school closure, festivals, etc. as part of this module? What is the average time to administer this module, and how much time is needed to properly train the interviewers? We referred to the challenge of training and the need for skilled interviewers, but how much time would it need to train them, and how much time would it need to implement the actual module? I'm assuming this is about mix.
Yeah, actually, surprisingly, in the field test, it was surprisingly not very time consuming. And I think if I remember correctly, the average time was less than 10 minutes. But of course, this is also in settings with children, depending on the group of children that you are dealing with. I mean, when we administer adolescents, the instrument to adolescents in Zimbabwe, 15 to 17, and a lot of them spend a lot of time in, attending some kind of educational institution. So that takes a big chunk of their time. We added contextual variables to understand, for example, if they were doing any learning after school hours, which is, and one of the activities listed in the ICATUS. But we wanted to understand, because this is important for programming, whether, if they're doing any homework after or learning, do they do it alone? Do they do it with support? Is that support, paid or unpaid? Because, that has implications for learning outcomes, and it's important for our education, UNICEF education programming. Even those contextual variables, in many cases, didn't take much more additional time. And I think one of the things is that we will learn more about when we implement this module across different settings. I think we'll learn more about how, duration of the interview varies depending on, the specific situation of the child. As I mentioned, that we have introduced new activities to capture issues that are increasingly more relevant for children and adolescents. But it's also some of these activities, the prevalence may vary, right? In rural versus urban settings, and depending on also across countries too. So it may be that it just, we'll see that in some settings or for certain groups, just getting that granularity and additional information may make the administration longer. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of variation in the 3 settings to test but I think this is something that we're going to learn more about as we roll out the module. In terms of training, we don't have a magic formula for how long, how many hours, but we do know that there are different components that we need to pay attention to, and we will make some recommendations about training for teams. But one is the interviewing techniques, right, which are different from the administration of a scripted question. So this is very important, and we need to spend time in practicing and with mock-up interviews, but also going to the field and getting some exposure and an opportunity to practice. And we know that there is another component that is very important, which is the coding of the activities. So understanding, especially for those activities that may seem, we have domains, we have sub-activities. When a child or a caregiver reports an activity, where does that activity fall exactly, in coding that? And I think, there's some, it is involved, to go through that and to just provide accurate, or relevant examples for every particular context. So those components and the coding of the list of activities, we try to keep it to minimize, right, the number of activities, and focus on those that we think are a priority for children. Of course, there are many other activities that we sort of grouped, and so that they, so that interviewers don't have to really understand, how to, separate them and identify them correctly and code them. But we tried our best to simplify that, but still it is quite involved. So those components are very important, I think. And I don't know, Lauren, if you have anything else that maybe I've missed.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to add that some of this is contextual, of course, on the level of granularity you want, as you said. I mean, as an example, in Belize, we collected very granular information. So if you take the category of sleep in ICATUS, it breaks it down into night sleep, essential night sleep, and then napping. And we said, okay, let's do that. And then at some point we thought, we're asking about children 5 to 17. Is it really important from a policy and programming perspective to know about napping for those children? Probably not. These are not under 5s. Or ICATUS can ask separately about eating and then, drinking without eating. And so we had that level of granularity and then stepped back and said, okay, it's good enough for our reasons to just ask about time spent eating. And so, the less granularity, of course, the less coding errors there could be, the less time you need to spend on training. And I think both Ava and I probably observed during the field test, there's a steep learning curve with the enumerators, because as Ava was saying, this is not a scriptive business as usual. So there was a lot of practice for them to get comfortable, but you could see, during those field practices, after maybe the 3rd, 4th interview, it started to flow much better as the interviewers themselves got very comfortable. So it requires a lot of upfront training, but was really interesting to observe their comfort increase. Over.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and thank you indeed to all 4 presenters, to Francesca, to Iliana, to Lauren, to Eva. This has been really great. I myself have think of myself as being educated on this topic. It was very informative, excellent presentations. Thank you so much. And I would like to leave the floor to my colleague Archana, who is going to wrap up the webinar for all of us.
Yes, thank you, all of you. It was a great presentation, and just wanted to remind you about the next webinar, which will take place 2 Wednesdays from now on March 22nd. And the topic will be data collection of blood samples for anemia and the latest developments. Just a reminder that the presentation's recording will be available on the UNICEF SharePoint site, and the recording itself will be available publicly on the Mix YouTube channel. So thank you all again. Thank you to all the participants for your comments and questions, and we will see you in a few weeks. Bye-bye all.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.